This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello there and welcome to episode 81 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. Today we're talking about getting culture shock in your home country. Now, if you had told me about this, 15, 20 years ago, the fact that I could land in Australia, my home country, somewhere I've spent, 90% of my life, and feel culture shock, I would have said you're crazy. But then I lived around the world, Japan, Slovakia, Germany, and travelled a lot in between. And I spent most of that time, 99% of that time away from Australia. And then I came back to live here and gosh, it was really hard. I was shocked by some of the things that I experienced in Australia. So that's the classic reverse culture shock. And it turns out I am so not alone in that. So today I'm going to talk to 3 different guests who've all had their own experiences of culture shock in their home countries. But before I get to my guests, I do want to thank this month's sponsor again, Glamping Hub. I'm really grateful for their sponsorship to help make the Thoughtful Travel Podcast possible. So since this week's episode is about that reverse culture shock issue, well, I remember when I was going through the worst of it, that one of my solutions to reverse culture shock was just to run away. And so I was looking on Glamping Hub and I'm figuring if you're going to run away, I think run away to a tree house. So Glamping Hub has a cool collection of tree house accommodation. I've never stayed in a tree house, but I have long wanted to. And now I have a 7-year-old son who's obsessed by the tree house books by Andy Griffiths. I'm not sure if they're famous in the rest of the world, but Aussies will definitely know what I mean. And so treehouse accommodation is high at the top of our list. So Glamping Hub has a heap of accommodation in tree houses, lots in North America especially, and some in Europe. There is a most gorgeous one I just saw in Lake Bled in Slovenia. And if my magic carpet was working, I would head there right now, I think. So if you're intrigued too, head over to glampinghub.com and have a look around. And now on to my first guest today, which is the lovely Kati Craythorne. So she was born in Germany, but has lived in Australia for quite some time now. But despite that, she experienced quite a lot of reverse culture shock going back to Germany. In fact, she continues to each time she visits.
Every time I go back to Germany these days, I have reverse culture shock.
What happens when you go back to Germany?
I tend to go back probably every 2 or 3 years. The one thing I noticed straight away is how hectic life is. And that might be because I grew up in Berlin, and every time I go back to Berlin, it's a kind of a mega city compared to Australian cities. Melbourne is big, where I used to live, but nothing like the amount of people that you would have in Berlin.
And Berlin's like higher density, isn't it? Like a lot more apartments and stuff.
Yes, lots of public transport, lots of people on the road, on the buses, on the trains. And I just find everybody stresses and runs around like crazy. And I really feel that. And I really I find it exciting as well as really alienating in some ways these days. Even though when you go into the city here, like Melbourne or Brisbane or wherever, it can still be packed and busy, but it's just different in Europe, I find, and that I struggle with. I can struggle with the so-called German unfriendliness.
Oh, really?
But I think I get it more because I'm German and I speak German, and my husband doesn't feel that at all. So when he's come with me to Germany, he thinks they're all wonderful and so friendly and everybody wants to help him. And I keep saying to him, well, it's because you speak English. So everybody is keen to practice their English and is very keen to help you.
Yes, true.
Yes, I speak German and I ask a question because let's say I don't know how to buy a train ticket anymore because,
it's different to
the machines change and I just go, I've forgotten, I don't know how these things work. So I go and ask a question about it. And they treat me like an idiot because why would I not know? Clearly I'm from Berlin because they can hear that I've still got the Berlin accent.
Yeah.
So why am I asking such a stupid question?
And they're not happy to help.
No. So actually what I do these days is I switch to English and pretend I don't know German.
Oh,
So that
really?
I do. I know. I probably shouldn't, but I find that really helps. And people suddenly
That's
they're all friendly and
hilarious.
nice and want to help me. And sometimes I
Oh,
feel
no.
sorry for them because they're trying to speak in English and it's really hard.
But it's too late for you then to switch
It's too
to
late. I know
native
exactly. I
speaker
can't.
German, isn't it?
So I can get a bit of sort of culture shock and just I forget how things work and how busy life is. Um,
Interesting.
but I remember one time when I came back from South Africa. I lived in South Africa. I went to South Africa a few times, and the second time I think I lived there for 4 or 5 months, and I was on my own. I was doing research there, and I came back to Australia, and I had severe culture shock coming back.
Okay. In what way?
One was the security question because I was on my own in South Africa, so I was a lot more aware of, my surroundings, locking the car when you're in the car, when you're driving through the cities or the townships or whatever, kind of not stopping at red lights because it was really drummed into me when I was there, do not ever stop at the red light, especially not at night, just keep driving through it. And just kind of automatically getting into the car, lock, drive off. And then coming back here going, oh, I don't have to lock the car. Do I have to lock the car? No, I don't have to lock the car. Do I? Yes, no.
Culture shock returning to where you live, I guess, doesn't have to be your home country either, does it? With Kati experiencing it, returning to her new home country of Australia when she'd been visiting South Africa. It's a really strange phenomenon, but we are definitely not alone in experiencing it. And my next guest is Abby Lutis, who has spoken with a lot of people who have experienced culture shock when they return home. In fact, she's just started working as a life coach, helping people in exactly that situation. But we chatted about her reverse culture shock when she returned from a long stint of travelling. You may remember from an episode last year that she was actually training for the Olympic bobsled team across North America and Europe, and especially a long time in Canada. But she really had trouble fitting in back home when she returned to Australia.
I sort of had this long stint away where I was travelling and ended up living in Canada. And I'd heard about and seen some friends, go through this phase of when they return back into their, home country or the hometown. And I couldn't quite understand, what it was before. I could see that they were experiencing, going through a pretty horrible time, but I couldn't really understand it. So when I was coming home and preparing to come home from Canada, I really thought, well, I know what people go through. They go through this time where it's just lost, uncertainty, not sure of what they're going to do next. And in most cases, if people have been away for, over 6 months, they've got into the routine of living their life in a different way. And then, as we spoke about before, they've seen so much of the world and their mind's been so expanded, and they come back to perhaps almost like a very sort of small awareness, or people maybe around them haven't traveled or haven't, certainly haven't had the adventure that they had. And you just can't really explain that. We talked about that before. You can't, there's no way that they'll be able to grasp the concept. And so you're left there on your own, sort of like, oh, how do I fit into this puzzle now? Like, I don't really sort of relate to these people as much as I did, and where is my place? And I really was thinking, I'm coming home with a positive attitude. I'm excited. I want to get back into my friendship circles. But, life goes on for them, and people, come back and they've got married and started families, and that's at a different stage of life to where I am. And so you just can't relate. And it's like, oh, hang on a minute. It's like people are going about their day-to-day life, and I've come from this environment where everyone's just wanting to meet you and wanting to know your story. And
Yes.
maybe for the first month that you're back, people are like, oh, how was your trip? And you sort of have, oh, we did this and this and this. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's good. And on to the next topic type thing. And you're like, hang on a minute. Like,
I've got more.
Yeah.
It's so hard, isn't it? One of my previous guests had a name for it. I think he called it the refrigerator problem or something, because he'd say he and his girlfriend had, lived abroad for a few years, and they would tell a bit of a story or something they'd done, and their friend would say, oh, okay, yeah, oh, look, I bought this new refrigerator last week.
Yeah, and it's like you sort of think, oh, okay. But I think it's really that those people haven't had the experience that you have, and so it's really hard for them to grasp the excitement and the amazing journey that you've been on. And it can be really hard to share that, and unless you're talking to a fellow traveler that has been through that process, or someone that's really interested. And I think the travelers amongst us are those types of people, and they want to know more, and where have you been and what have you seen.
Yeah, give me details, please. Yeah, and it's important to find those people, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's not everyone's like cup of tea. And, I must admit in the beginning, I didn't think it was mine either. Like my cousin would go away, and I was always intrigued by her stories, but I just didn't think it was for me. And it wasn't until I went out and actually experienced it for myself was that I was like, oh, where has this been all my life, and why didn't I think this was something for me?
Yes, you see, so that's exactly why I always think, the people who think it's not for them, they just haven't tried it right yet. Everyone would love it if they did it. Yeah. So I'm not very tolerant of people who just say, oh, no, travelling's, I just don't like travelling. I just think, but you just haven't done it right yet.
Yeah, but the reverse culture shock, it really is an interesting phenomena, because it is that feeling of just coming back and feeling unsettled and uneasy and having these empty feelings, because we've gone out and there, seen in most cases just seen so much, had these incredible experiences, and and gone in perhaps into developing countries and seeing different cultures, and everything can kind of seem a little bit insignificant back in the the real world.
yeah, that's right. It's a very difficult thing to readjust, I think. So have you got some main strategies that you use to readjust?
Well, for me, like because I was aware of this, and, anyone that's aware of coming home and the feelings that might happen, is just to be really prepared and be excited, but also have a bit of a strategy and a plan for what it is that you're going to do, and really know that, it's going to be, like I said, your friends may have moved on and be at a different stage in life, and you just have to be accepting, and know that perhaps you're going to have to sort of pick up the pieces and find the people who you relate to. And so for me, that sort of meant exploring, as we said before, being so lucky to have all this technology that we can, find our communities and find the tribes that we want to spend our time with. So, really putting yourself into different types of, social groups. Nowadays on Facebook, there's groups for just about anything. So
very true.
Whether it's in the community, going out and meeting new people and trying new things, getting into sports and activities, recreation, so that you can perhaps meet the people with the interests that you have. And because I think that having the support of friends and family around you is like having the right environment can really impact so much.
I think that's so true. So when I first moved back from abroad, and I'd lived abroad for sort of 5.5 years, and and I didn't really know that reverse culture shock would happen.
Yeah.
and it hit really badly. But about a month or so in, I got a job so I'd been teaching English abroad, and I got a job teaching English here in Perth. And so
Yeah.
it turned out that all of my colleagues were also people like me who had lived abroad teaching English, and then either they were actually from somewhere else and had come to Perth to teach for a while, or they were from Perth and they'd, come back. But they all totally understood me, and I understood them. And of course, our students were from all around the world. So it was like kind of traveling a little bit every day in the classroom. And that was really, the saving grace for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think like surrounding yourself with those types of people, getting back into like the routine is also a really great thing. So keeping in touch with the people that you met along your travels, and planning for the next trip. And I think that maybe it's not like you want to sort of put a Band-Aid fix by just like going off again. And I think it's important to really embrace that there are the high times and the low times, and just being comfortable with that uncomfortable transition, and knowing that it's just a phase and that it will pass as well. But I think when you get out there and go off on your next trip, or, whether you become a tourist in your own backyard and see things close to home, just getting that thirst for adventure back and finding your tribe, I think are really key key areas to sort of focus on in dealing with reversed culture shock.
Abby very sensibly says that travelling again is just a Band-Aid fix, but I'm still for running away to a glamping hub treehouse. So I still think that's an excellent strategy, at least to have a bit of a break from, feeling a bit out of sorts with reverse culture shock. Anyway, my final guest today is James Thomas. So he has lived in Taiwan for many, many years, but grew up in the United States. And when he returns to the US, he does experience quite the culture shock, despite it being his home country. I loved our chat with James, and James is a fellow podcaster, and halfway through, I think it turned into him interviewing me, but I thought it was still a really interesting chat.
I went back recently to the US to attend the LA Podfest, and I did get into a little bit of reverse culture shock, and I was aware of the most was how things are conveniently placed in the United States. It's so convenient to do certain things, as far as, getting things to eat and things like that. Not so maybe about the variety, but it was so convenient. I did find it a little bit harder to actually open up conversations with people there. And I just don't understand why. Maybe that's part of the reverse culture shock and things like that. Because, if I went back and say to congregate with family and friends, I have to be very careful about how I talk about my expat experience. Because as an expat, sometimes you want other people back in your home nation to also experience what you have. And you become sometimes excited to tell them, okay, this is what we do over there and this is what we do over there. But you don't want to appear to be, how would you say, uppity about your overseas experience, because some people back home, they are less likely to have, because of a lot of reasons, to have the will to travel overseas or to live abroad and things like that. And that's something you have to be aware of. And they have nothing to compare it to. A lot of my relatives have never been outside half the Northeast coast or whatever.
Wow.
To talk to them about living overseas can make them feel quite abandoned, and have to be careful about that, because you have to be aware sometimes when you go back home, not everybody back home will be able to have the tools to compare your overseas experience with anything else. And it's just like when you go back home, you may be out of touch with a lot of the vocabularies that they use in their daily life, or music, or television shows and things like that. It's almost the same, but you still have to be a little bit more, how would you say, sensitive, that the reverse culture shock that you may be experiencing when you go back home. Understand that how that can also be affecting your friends and family back home.
Yes, oh, that's very good of you to phrase it that way about being sensitive. I used to just be kind of annoyed that nobody would listen to me, but I did understand that, exactly right. For them, life had been going on as normal. They knew all about what's happening there, and I was just somewhere far away. A lot of them wouldn't even know where I'd been, and nobody really wanted, there's always a couple of friends who, are genuinely interested in travel and cultural experiences and all of that, and you know who they are. But yes, I did take a while to learn. Really, most people didn't want to hear about anything, and I understand why. And it's hard to fit back in as well. I certainly had that reverse culture shock with, I was away for 6.5 years, all of the pop culture stuff, TV shows, music, all of that. And this was, pre-Netflix and stuff, and I just had no clue. I'd had zero idea. I'd been living in all non-English speaking countries, so I hadn't even had any, I just had zero clue. And honestly, I've never caught back up. I've been back in Australia for 10 years, and I kind of missed so much that it seemed not, in TV, it can take a lot of time to watch. I just kind of never really caught back up with what I'd missed. And, and then everyone got into the having kids phase. And so I know all about kids shows, but I've never really caught up in that era. And I still will be at places with friends and they'll have conversations about TV and stuff that I just have no clue what they're talking about. A decade later, it was such a kind of such a lot that I missed that I feel like it's just too hard to catch up. Perhaps it's not interesting enough for me to want to catch up, and I'd rather spend my time, I don't know, listening to travel podcasts instead. But and it's such a big chunk of life that I kind of missed that it's just gone for me.
Well, I have a question for you then. Do you feel that you being back, and maybe a lot of people, friends, family, where you are back home, you obviously know that they don't have the same experience you have. Do you find yourself really aggressively looking to make those contacts with other expats, whether they're local to you or not, to kind of like share the overseas experience? Because myself, I find the expats here in Taiwan, they are really not concerned about expat life elsewhere, and I find it hard to try to explain or try to share ideas about not only expat life here in Taiwan, but expat life in Japan, Korea, and things like that. Have you ever had that kind of feeling or anything related in that form?
Oh, absolutely. So I think one thing that saved me when I first came back was that I fairly quickly got a job teaching ESL, teaching English here in Perth, and my school was full of people exactly like me. So the other teachers, probably 3/4 of them had recently come back from being expats and living abroad. And all of them were interested in language and culture because it's kind of the nature of being an English teacher, certainly in Australia anyway, because it's very poorly paid. So you only do it if you have a really, strong interest in that kind of stuff. So I think that really saved me and I made some, very good friends immediately there amongst the fellow teachers. So I think, I still have a lot of those friendships today. And I think we had so much in common. We had that expat experience in common. We had an interest in other cultures, an interest in languages, and we could talk all day in the lunchroom about our, different experiences, and they wanted to hear mine and I wanted to hear theirs. So, that was, like a pivotal part of actually being able to settle back down in Perth. I think if I'd come back and kind of returned to jobs I had previously, which didn't have that kind of workplace culture, I probably would have got up and left again, I think. So, that was really, really useful. And because, of course, the classes that we taught were full of, you'd have students from 10 or 12 different countries in one class. So it was kind of like going to work and traveling all day, every day. It was so interesting. And, I learnt so much about, additional cultures, places I hadn't lived. So I think that's what really saved me. So that's 4 of us in this episode who've had these experiences of having quite a culture shock when we return to our home country. Now, you might have experienced the same thing yourself, or you might know people who are going through that. I hope that this episode explains it to some extent and makes people and travellers aware of it. I think if I'd known more about reverse culture shock when I returned from living abroad, I would have coped a lot better than I did. So it's kind of it's a real first world problem in that sense, but it's still a real issue, and I think it's an interesting one to think about. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to episode 81 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. First of all, a huge big thank you and shout out to the sponsor, Glamping Hub. Don't forget to go to glampinghub.com and check out some of their super cool accommodation. And then my first guest today was Kati from Queensland and Beyond. So she has a gorgeous blog at queenslandandbeyond.com. Lots of great travelling stories and beautiful pictures too. After Kati, I spoke with Abby Lutus, and you can find Abby at abbylutus.com. That's ABBY, and Lutus is LEWTAS. She has some great stuff happening there. And finally, James from 4Seas One Family. 4 seas as in the ocean kind of seas. So he talks a lot about expat life and has some great stuff there and resources too. And you might be interested in going back to episode 51 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast, which was also about reverse culture shock with a few other great travelling lovers. So have a look at that, or a listen in fact. I'll put a link in the show notes, or you can just go to notaballerina.com/51. And of course, for this episode, the show notes will be at notaballerina.com/81. Please also consider, if you're using Apple Podcasts, hop in and leave a rating and a review for the Thoughtful Travel podcast. It really helps to get new listeners in, and that's always a big bonus and exciting to have you on board. If you are on Facebook, come along and join the Thoughtful Travellers group. It's a fun place with lots of really interesting conversation. I just love what happens in there. So just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook and request to join, or go to the link in the show notes. Thanks so much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.